Good afternoon. This is Kyle Viola coming at you with another video, Coffee and Jesus. Here we go. So I want to come on today and share just a story from the Old Testament. Just felt like, we talk about all this stuff in the New Testament and all the spiritual talk, but I like the stories of the Old Testament. And it takes a lot of time to read through these stories. And you'll actually find out that 70% of the Bible is stories. But stories are actually very significant and impactful in giving us a message and actually understanding God and his personality, getting to know him through these stories, not just made up stories. Like, this is historical documents. And so I'm going to read from the New Living Translation, and I'm just going to jump into Elijah's story, Elijah the prophet. So Elijah, he actually talks to, during this time that he was, serving the Lord, Ahab and Jezebel killed like 400 something prophets. And Elijah kind of was just like the last one left, and he was kind of running away from them. But the Lord told him to go back and to actually confront Ahab. And he actually goes to someone named Obadiah, and Elijah is asking Obadiah to go to Ahab on his behalf. And he says, but Elijah said, I swear by the Lord Almighty, in whose presence I stand, that I will present myself to Ahab this very day. So interestingly, that Elijah declares that he stands in the presence of God. So Obadiah went to tell Ahab that Elijah had come, and Ahab went out to meet Elijah. When Ahab saw him, he exclaimed, so is it really you, you troublemaker of Israel? So King Ahab, he's king of this big nation, and Elijah's the troublemaker. So Elijah just states truthfully, I have made no trouble for Israel. Elijah replied, you and your family are the troublemakers, for you have refused to obey the commands of the Lord and have worshipped the images of Baal instead. As a matter of fact, because of Ahab's disobedience to the Lord, they were suffering a famine all over. So now he says, now summon all Israel to join me at Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who are supported by Jezebel. So there's 850 prophets, false prophets, that worship Baal and Asherah in Israel. And Ahab and Jezebel supported these people. So Ahab summoned all the people of Israel and the prophets to Mount Carmel. Then Elijah stood in front of them and said, how much longer will you waver, hobbling between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him. But the people were completely silent. So God is working through Elijah. And this is interesting throughout history and throughout the Bible. You'll see that God makes moves with these few people on a grand scale where it's actually a really dark time. And it's like a really, bad rulership and oppression. So Elijah's confronting King Ahab. Then Elijah said to them, I am the only prophet of the Lord who is left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Now bring 2 bulls. The prophets of Baal may choose whichever one they wish and cut it into pieces and lay it on the wood of their altar, but without setting fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood on the altar, but not set fire to it. Then call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by setting fire to the wood is the true God. And all the people agreed. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, you go first, for there are many of you. Choose one of the bulls and prepare it and call on the name of your God, but do not set fire to the wood. So they prepared one of the bulls and placed it on the altar. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning until noontime, shouting, oh, Baal, answer us. But there was no reply of any kind. Then they danced, hobbling around the altar that they had made. About noontime, Elijah had begun mocking them. You'll have to shout louder, he scoffed, for surely he is a god. Perhaps he is daydreaming, or he is relieving himself, or maybe he is away on a trip, or is asleep. and needs to be awakened. So they shouted louder, and following their normal custom, they cut themselves with knives and swords until the blood gushed out. This is what people do in these, even in cults today. They shed their own blood, thinking it's going to do something. He took 12 stones, one to represent each of the tribes of Israel, and he used the stones to rebuild the altar in the name of the Lord. Then he dug a trench around the altar, large enough to hold about 3 gallons. He piled wood on the altar, cut the bull into pieces, and laid the pieces on the wood. Then he said, "Fill 4 large jars with water, and pour the water over the offering and the wood." After they had done this, he said, "Do the same thing again." And then they were finished. He said, "Now do it a 3rd time." So they did as he said. So a lot of water was poured out all over this altar, Elijah's altar, and filled up the trench with water. And the water ran around the altar and even filled the trench. At the usual time for offering the evening sacrifice, Elijah, the prophet, walked up to the altar and prayed, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Now here's another key. He is calling on the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This family, through Abraham, is a covenant that was established, a right relationship with the one true living God. It was through Abraham. So God isn't their God. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And anyone who joins in this covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is under the covenant of the one true living God. Prove today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all this at your command. So he's doing it all under God's authority. O Lord, answer me. Answer me so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God and that you have brought them back to yourself. So this is also a process of God bringing the people back to himself. And God is here to prove himself. And he's using Elijah. God works through and with prophets all throughout the Bible, you see. Immediately, the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust. And the stones and the dust. It even licked up all the water in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell face down on the ground and cried out, "The Lord, he is God. Yes, the Lord is God." Then Elijah commanded, "Seize all the prophets of Baal. Don't let a single one escape." So everything turned around from there. Of course, there's a big audience of people. It was a big portion of Israel that was watching and witnessing this contest. So, of course, God, the one true living God, wins. But there's a large portion of people that follow a false ideology. And these are the people of Israel. They were given the covenant of God, but they weren't following under the covenant of God. They were in disobedience. And so this was also to prove to Ahab who the one true living God is too. But Ahab over and over just refused to obey and come under God. He listened to his wife Jezebel, and they all got into big trouble. But Elijah had to go through this thing. I'm going to actually jump into that. So Elijah, so now Jezebel wanted to kill him. Ahab went back home. They would just want to kill Elijah. Elijah was afraid and fled for his life. So even being a prophet of God, he was still had a human emotion of being afraid. He went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, and he left his servant there. Then he went on alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died." Then he lay down and slept under the broom tree. But as he was sleeping, an angel touched him and told him, "Get up and eat." So God has his angels to help in a time of need. He looked around, and there beside his head was some bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. This was a supernatural occurrence, an angel visitation to Elijah, and Elijah was provided baked bread and a jar of water. But this was supernatural. This was probably heavenly bread and heavenly water, because this is what it says. So he ate and drank and lay down again. Then the angel of the Lord came again and touched him and said, "Get up and eat some more, or the journey ahead will be too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank, and the food gave him enough strength to travel 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. There he came to a cave where he spent the night. So Mount Sinai was the same mountain that Moses brought the people to, but Moses went up Mount Sinai and met with God. Now Elijah is here as well. And by the way, I believe, in my opinion, I think this is where Jesus was also on these mountains, because Jesus went up the mountain with his disciples, and he was transfigured into his glorious state. And Moses and Elijah was right there with him. And I believe in this time and place, it was where God visits, an eternal realm is present. And I believe that's where Moses, Elijah, Jesus, and the Father met in this timeless realm. So anyways, that's just a side note, but I'll just keep going with the story. But the Lord said to him, so now the Lord speaks to Elijah. What are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah replied, I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you, torn down your altars, and killed every one of your prophets. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. Go out and stand before me on the mountain, the Lord told him. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by. His presence passed by, and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire there was the sound of a gentle whisper. So God's passing by, and all this is happening, the intensity, maybe it's his presence, his glory, whatever it may be. But it's saying that the Lord himself wasn't in those things, but that the Lord was in the sound of a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave, and a voice said, What are you doing here, Elijah? He replied again, I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you. And same thing. Then the Lord told him, Go back the same way you came, and travel to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive there, anoint Hazael to be king of Aram, then anoint Jehu, grandson of Nimshi, to be king of Israel, and anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from the town of Abel-Maholah, to replace you as my prophet. Anyone who escapes from Hazael will be killed by Jehu, and those who escape Jehu will be killed by Elisha. Yet I will preserve 7,000 others in Israel who have never bowed down to Baal or kissed him. So this is the interesting part, is that God is in the still small whisper of the Spirit. And that's where he speaks, and that's where he gives his instructions. So we have to not get distracted by all the intensities of things that's going on around us, but listen to the still small voice of the Spirit. So I hope it was an interesting story for you, and God bless you, and I will see you next time. Coffee and Jesus. Here we go.